We now move to our third and final panel discussion of the day, which will reflect on the theme Climate, Journalism, Newsroom Time versus Geological Time. I'd like to hand the floor over to the panel chair, my colleague Dr. Trish Morgan, who is an assistant professor in the School of Communications. Trish, over to you.
Thank you, Dermot, and thanks to... Oh, thank you. Yes. So thanks to all of you for remaining with us for the entire, if you like, the long-term view of this conference and staying till our last panel. As you can see from the slide, this panel is titled Climate Journalism, Newsroom Time versus Geological Time. And I think many of our speakers today already have given us a sense of those both kind of complementary and also conflicting temporalities under which we have to negotiate and navigate our environmental issues of our time. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our very distinguished guests today on maybe how we tease that out when it comes to actually communicating those issues of our time. So we have Shauna, John, Sinéad and Dave with us, and I'm going to introduce everybody more fully before they speak. Everybody's going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then depending on time, I might fire a few questions to kind of tease out the debate a little bit more and also give yourselves opportunities to contribute as well. So I'm very much looking forward to having this hopefully convivial atmosphere for this media panel. So I'd like to hand over to our first guest. Our first guest is Shauna Corr, and she's an environmental correspondent, and she covers the whole island of Ireland for Reach plc. And Reach plc publishes the Irish Mirror, the Daily Star, and Belfast and Dublin Live, amongst other publications. So she reports on the environment, on climate crisis, biodiversity, agriculture, pollution, social justice, and many other key areas to do with our kind of current contemporary society. A key thing for Shauna is the cost of living, and she sees a direct correlation between environmental issues and those of society as a whole, so linking in with those ideas of inequality as well. For Shauna, injustice is her biggest driver, and she's very passionate about giving a voice to communities who are trying to build a more healthy, peaceful, inclusive and sustainable society through looking at this through an environmental lens. So I'm very happy to hand over to Shauna for her contribution.
I haven't even started yet and I'm getting a clap. Thank you so much, first and foremost, for having me. I was absolutely delighted to get the invitation. And I think the theme's a really interesting one, obviously working in a very busy newsroom, both north and south, and trying to split my time between those two beats, as it were. So, but I think something that really UNFCCC Chief Executive Simon Steele said recently has really sort of stood out in my head as like a ticking clock, really. He said over the last week, we have 2 years to save the world. And when it comes to reaction to that and how we're working around that issue and climate on the whole, if you ask me if we're acting like this is an emergency, I would say no. But I would put that with the proviso that we have come a long way. I've been doing this role for roughly about 2 years now. I started out working in the north as a news reporter who had a sort of side interest in writing about environmental issues, about pollution. And when I was seeing all of these huge issues rear their heads around me, it really, really shocked me that about 10 years ago, no one was writing about sand extraction. No one was writing about the fact that gold miners were coming in their droves to have a look at what we have under the ground. Very few people were writing about water pollution, about air pollution and all the rest of it. And that's sort of what set me down this path. But at the same time, I was a hard news reporter, so it was sort of a bit of a side kind of interest, and I would do those stories when I had the time. Now, I'm really lucky in the sense that then a couple of years ago, my boss at Reach Ireland came to me and said, we're going to create a role for an environment correspondent, and I think you'd be a perfect fit for it. So for the last 2 years, my focus has been largely on that issue. And in that time, we really, really have ramped up what we report. I cover all of those issues, both north and south. I've been to countries like Somalia to bring back to people here what's happening there in relation to drought and people going hungry, people dying as a result of this crisis. And then also the COP conferences, where I've made a lot of contacts down through the years. And we've had great coverage in our newspapers on those issues. I'm not going to say we're perfect. There's always time to do more, and there could be a lot more resources put in to this beat. But it's no longer, in my publication anyway, it's no longer just a niche issue. You know, we're sitting in newsroom conferences now, and other reporters are raising these issues, and other reporters are bringing in stories of this nature, and that's really where we want to be, because it can't just be considered a niche issue. I think everybody across the press needs to be taking interest in this. But I think really in terms of newsroom time versus geological time, there are really three main issues that we need to think about. First, our job as the media in reporting it, holding truth to power, what they're doing, what they're not doing. Are they meeting the targets that they've set for themselves? And we heard from Mary Robinson that earlier today that, you know, the Irish government could be doing a lot better on that front. And then we've also got the change in attitudes in society now. And I think that means that in the grand scheme of things, we must be doing something right. 80% of people in Ireland roughly now think that the government should make climate and the environment a high priority. My own editor, Neil Leslie, I think he was here somewhere earlier on today, you know, he's come to DCU himself to do a climate course. So it is being taken in seriously within the newsroom. But I also think that in this conversation, we need to bring social media into the room. And it has a huge impact with the spread of misinformation and disinformation and everything else. But I think the media on the whole, and news as an industry, has a very sort of strained relationship with social media in a way, because not only have they sort of sucked up all the resources that we might have had 20 years ago to put resources into reporting on issues like this, you know, they're taking our advertisers in abundance, but then you've got the fact that we now largely rely on them to help spread the word on the stories that we do write, on the likes of Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, you know, all of these new things. But as far as I can see, I don't think social media is very environmentally friendly in the respect that, you know, it's the data centres, where does all that data go, where is it stored, and what's needed to power those data centres. But I also think in the respect that they don't really like climate stories, they don't do that well. So that in itself then plays into how newsrooms cover these issues. Are they going to be getting massive numbers of clicks, you know, and that on a daily grind and having to work on breaking news and all the rest of it, that has a massive impact on the amount of stories and the amount of resources that are put into this. And then we've also got, just to move it on a little bit, the third thing really that we've got to think about, and I suppose internally in the media, we've got to think about the fact that we are an industry and we too have a carbon footprint. And I think that, you know, that's not really something that's often discussed. You know, the knowledge and the content that we create all has to go somewhere. And the movement is away from newspapers, which in themselves would have a carbon footprint because they're printed on trees. But then we've also got to think about where we're storing our data, what data centres we're using and all the rest of it. And then finally, I'd like to talk about the role of government. I know this has been raised, and I'm sorry, my time's running short as well, so I'll be as quick as I possibly can. The role of government, all this, and this has been raised a few times today already. So we saw how seriously and, you know, in an emergency, the government can act when it comes to issues that are going to impact every one of us in this room and wider society. But when it comes to climate, they haven't treated it with anywhere near the urgency. And our job as reporters is to report on what they're doing, look for the gaps in the system and all the rest of it. But I think really what we need to see is a bit more prevalence for this subject, because it is going to impact everybody in the years to come. So really, just to sum up, I think we have come a long way in the last 10 years when environmental harms really didn't get that much of a mention in the press. But I do think that there is a lot more to do.
Thank you very much, Shauna. You've really set the scene for us on many different dimensions to do with these conflicts between newsroom time and geological time. I'd like to hand over to John Gibbons, our next contributor. John is a journalist by training, and he's a very experienced public speaker on environment and climate issues. He's been giving talks in schools and universities, as well as being a guest speaker in a wide range of public events. He has been writing and campaigning on environment and climate issues for the last decade and a half, including a 3-year stint as a weekly environmental columnist with the Irish Times. He's founder of the website climatechange.ie, and also he runs the blog at thinkorswim.ie, which I think some of us will be very familiar with as well. And he regularly appears on national broadcast media outlets as well, including RTE and Virgin, Today FM and Newstalk. And he has been a weekly environmental columnist with The Last Word on Today FM for the last 3 years. And he's also a co-author of the Rutledge Handbook of Environmental Journalism. So thank you very much, John. Looking forward to hearing your contributions.
Thanks very much, Trish. Well, first of all, thank you very much to DCU for the opportunity to be here. I'm a graduate of the journalism school here from many, many years ago, so it's always a pleasure to come back. The place has grown and grown in the meanwhile, that's for sure. I suppose it's always difficult to know where to start when we're talking about media and climate. I think how are we doing is often a good place to start, and probably the short answer is probably not that terribly well. Now, Shauna and a handful of her colleagues are kind of frontline newspaper journalists doing at the sharp end of the stick, doing, if I might say, a great job. But they represent a tiny fragment of our media, really tiny. And for me, the drop down dead aspect of the climate emergency and the biodiversity emergency is how incredibly few resources are actually thrown at this crisis by our media. Specifically, I'll start with our national broadcaster as the one with the largest resources, but it spreads right through the media. Given the significance of the issue that we're dealing with here, which, by the way, for anyone in the room who isn't aware, this is the big one, then for this not to be something that newsrooms are basically throwing teams of reporters at in 2024, leaves me breathless, quite frankly. It's astounding. Now, we were asked to talk about newsroom time versus geological time, and I like to think of a period, I think it's just under 252 million years ago. It was called the End Permian Mass Extinction Event. I'm sure many people here will be familiar with it. Now, in that, not personally, but you've read about it. Anyway, during that event, about 90% of marine species, 70% of all terrestrial vertebrates vanished. So pretty much the Earth went quiet for about 10 million years. Now, we know, again, from paleoclimatology, the cause for this. Don't worry, it wasn't us this time, right? But the sort of salient point for me, first of all, what they called, it happened in the blink of a geological eye, meaning that this disaster was spun out over tens of thousands of years, right? Geologically speaking, it was a almost instantaneous disaster. However, at the absolute peak of the End Permian, the maximum CO2 output, and CO2, of course, was the gas that lit the fire that fueled the disaster. At no time, at the peak of the End Permian mass extinction event, was CO2 output more than 1/10 of what it is on Earth today. Now, granted, we're only a couple of hundred years into this, but we're already running at 10 times the pace of the worst CO2-fueled disaster in Earth history. So that, to me, as a journalist, as a human being, as a news person, kind of go, gosh, that's interesting. I think we should maybe focus on this somewhat. Is all this CO2 burning and releasing this powerful, long-acting gas that's going to linger in the atmosphere for centuries and affect our children's and grandchildren's prospects in ways that we can only begin to imagine? Is that something we should be more focused on? Short answer is yes. Shauna again referred to, and there are many stats I could quote, One of them, for example, the EPA have done some very interesting research on Irish attitudes to climate change. And I've reported on them and written them up. But somehow I don't buy them. I just don't. And no disrespect to the EPA, but there's something about them that doesn't ring true, certainly with my lived experience. I found something, of course, you know the way I always find stats that we like. So I'm going to, well, at least that we think are more salient. So last month, DOCUS produced some, what I thought was more interesting take on this. And they looked at climate in particular. And what they calculated was, or estimated from their research, is that about 14%, that's 1 in 7 Irish people, believe that climate change will have a, quote, significant impact on them personally. That means 6 out of 7 Irish people think that climate change is somebody else's problem. That's the zinger. And many of those people, by the way, work in newsrooms. And many of them work at very senior levels in newsrooms where the penny simply hasn't dropped. And will continue to go deeper and deeper into this crisis. And how this plays out in Ireland, for example, we currently have now, depending on whether you count Luxembourg as a real country, we're no offence to any Luxembourgers present, but we're probably the highest per capita CO2 polluters in the entire EU 27, which is a pretty incredible thing. What that says to me is that we as a country, we haven't got real about this. We as a media are failing every single day. I'm sorry to say it, but we are. There are good people, as I said, doing their absolute best on it, but taken on the whole, right? Are we raising up to meet the challenge? And the short answer is no, we're not. And we have to be honest about that, because without being aware that we're failing, well, then we just continue to plod along on the current pathway, and that's simply not working for us. Now, Ireland as well, obviously we're a player within the EU 27, and I'm sure people will have seen in the last number of weeks, really disturbing things happening at EU level. And these are incredibly important. We're seeing the EU's Green New Deal being unpicked. We're seeing the nature restoration law being basically cast aside, and we're seeing the farm to fork programme of radical agricultural reform being thrown on the scrap heap. All these things are happening, yet what kind of debate have we had here in Ireland? What kind of media debate have we had about this? These are the most profound changes happening on a European level, and of course much of what's happening in Ireland is really a subset of European policy, and yet we're not seeing the animated discussions, we're not seeing the public engagement on these massive decisions. And I will say, we're not just takers in all this, we're not just policy takers, we're also policy makers. There's been plenty of Irish politicians and lobbyists out in Europe arguing and demanding worst possible outcomes, demanding it for their special sector, for whatever sector it is, the high polluting sectors in Ireland, demanding the right to continue to pollute our waterways, our skies, and pump out emissions with impunity. And we, the media, we need to stop being neutral. We need to challenge and take on these power sources, face them down and say it's not good enough, particularly from the point of view of intergenerational justice. We're the generation, the last generation, that has any realistic chance of having any impact whatsoever on the trajectory of climate disaster. We need to step up and we need to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for a very frank appraisal of our media landscape in Ireland. I'd like to now introduce our third speaker, Sinéad Crowley. She is Director of Media Development with Coimisiún Meán, Ireland's media regulator. It was established in 2023, and Coimisiún Meán is committed to ensuring a thriving, diverse and safe online media landscape. An Coimisiún builds on the work formerly done by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland and is also establishing a new regulatory regime for online safety. As Director of Media Development, Sinéad works in areas including sustainability, sectoral training and development, gender equality, diversity and inclusion and sponsorship. Prior to joining on Coimisiún, Sinéad worked as a journalist for more than 3 decades, most recently with RTE, and she was arts and media correspondent in that newsroom for over 16 years. And I'm delighted to also be proud of the fact that Sinéad has an undergraduate degree in communications from DCU, which I've just learned. So thank you very much, Sinéad. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure being back in DCU, and it seems like a long time that I did the degree in communications, and then it doesn't seem long at all. So I was here from 1990 to 1993, and at the time, looking back, it was a completely obviously different media landscape. There was no social media, there was no iPhones and so on. But actually then in another way it wasn't, because it was about communicating a story and telling a story. And I went on to work as a journalist for 30 years. I now work for the regulator, but we're still back at the heart of that, how to tell the story. And I want to talk a little bit about that today in this context, because I think in a way it's nice to be at the end of a day like this, because you can look back and draw on everything that was said earlier. And I think for those of us who attended the whole day, we'll remember Mary Robinson's daffodils, or we'll remember the speech about biodiversity from the younger contributors who were amazing, or we'll remember the HIT session, which was fantastic earlier as well from Ella Saltmarsh. So their messages, their communication, that's what people are going to bring home from this. And at the end of the day, that's what it's about. Newsrooms are frenetic, fast-paced places, and the story has to be told. And back when I started, it had to be told by 6 and 9. It's even more rapid now because it's the very next second on your social media feed. But at the same time, this incredibly difficult, important story of climate change has to be told. I want to tell you a little bit about what Commission Meán does in this space, just because it's so new and a lot of people aren't quite aware of what we do. So we support sustainability in a number of ways. We are involved in bringing the Albert Carbon Calculator, which is a tool for producers used to calculate the carbon on their projects. We're bringing that in-house, and we're going to be the country partner for that fairly shortly. We also support a Sustainability Media Ireland network, which brings broadcasters and others together that they can discuss issues around sustainability and indeed look at climate literacy education and so on, some of that in conjunction with DCU in the past as well. What we also do, and I think it's very important in the context of today, is we fund climate change content. We fund content through the Sound and Vision scheme, and recently there was a specific round for climate literacy, and a lot of you will have seen the programmes because they went out quite recently. There was Martin Bean's Ward programme about the end of the world. There was some wonderful radio content as well, in particular Ours to Protect, which is where local stations were able to tell, going back to the stories again, tell the local stories about sustainability, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's not about the big picture. It's about, will the person listening to their local radio in Waterford or Kerry or Clare hear something that resonates with them and say, yeah, this is something I can do, or this is something I can engage with. So that's some of the ways that we can help this issue. But the other important thing that we do, and that I think is hugely important to speak about today, is the sustainability of the media itself. Because the media itself, it's not just rapidly changing, but it's under huge pressure. Traditional media under pressure, as Shauna spoke about there, from social media, people getting their own sources of information, which, there's no guarantee where that information is coming from. So again, Commissioner Meán is very much concerned with Media Literacy Ireland, with, trying to get education out about that, get information out about that. We're going out to consultation at the moment for journalism schemes, which is where we're going to support court reporting and local democracy reporting. Again, 2 areas that are central to democracy, but weren't the ones that were, as Shauna was saying again, getting the clicks. They weren't the places where maybe journalists wanted to work. So that's something else we're supporting. So when we go back again to the topic of what we're speaking about today, yes, news moves quickly. Yes, editors want the next story, but there has to be a place there for the longer form stories, the more creative ways of telling the stories, and really for us work together to make sure that this message is as resonant with the people outside as some of the wonderful messages were today with those of you in the room. Thank you.
Sinead, thank you very much for those insights. I'd now like to move on to our final speaker, my colleague in the School of Communications, Dr. Dave Robbins. And Dave worked as an editor, columnist, feature writer and broadcaster in the Irish national media for 25 years before briefly getting involved in politics, where he stood for election for the Green Party in 2009, and he also worked as a special advisor for the Minister for the Environment up to 2011. Then Dave joined the staff of the School of Communications in 2016, and he helped set up the Dublin City University Centre for Climate and Society and the Master's Programme in Climate Change, Policy, Media and Society. His research examines media approaches to climate change, and he's been involved in training the staff of a range of media organisations on strengthening and deepening their climate coverage. So very much looking forward to hearing from you, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Trish. I'm just taking a note of my time so I can... actually, standing for the Greens, I just had a flashback because my old campaign manager just came in and sat down over there. Either that or I'm kind of seeing a ghost. It is you, Dermot, is it? So I'm going to bring this back, or try to bring this back to the theme around time. And I'm going to use... a couple of questions that Trish often uses in her work around political ecology. And actually, I probably should have cleared this with you. This could be live plagiarism you're witnessing here. But Trish would often ask, when is nature and where is nature? And I'm going to try and use that same framework to look at when is journalism and where is journalism. So if we think about journalism and time and when journalism happens, there's all these, as Sinead was saying, deadlines and kind of stress and newsrooms and, breaking news. And also the kind of race to get a scoop and beat your competitors to a story, this kind of idea that in often journalists are competing with each other and the real audience for their story isn't the public, it's other journalists to show that they got one over on them. This kind of idea about, the immediacy and urgency of news can lead to very kind of cynical type of helicopter journalism where journalists kind of just drop in, get a quote and drop out. So the time element there, the pressure of time, kind of forces them into a certain type of journalism. So you kind of would say, looking at all that and its connection with time, that journalism is about the now, what's happening now, what just happened. And if we think about all the contributions today, we can kind of see more that climate change isn't, although it's increasingly happening now, it has long roots in the past, as we spoke about, and it's cast a long shadow into the future. So one of the questions might be, is a concentration on the now in journalism serving us well with climate change coverage? The second element of time that I wanted to talk about it was also touched on by everybody else. We're looking at a media sector that is on its knees, and it's stripped of resources. Its advertising market has been cannibalized by social media platforms, and that has implications with time. I was delivering a piece of training to the Examiner Group, and one of their environmental reporters was saying he has to file 3 stories a day. And I was thinking about, what time is there to contact sources, to delve, to research, to even think when you're under that much time pressure. So time is the enemy of good journalism in that respect. The third element of time I just wanted to think about or share my thinking on is how journalists are trained. I did work in newsrooms for 25 years, and I'm involved in teaching journalism here. And it is hammered into every reporter that the news point, the juiciest, in inverted commas, the sexiest angle is in the first few words of the story. So we have to put the news first. In one of the manuals, it says that the greatest opening you could have to a news story begins with the 3 words, masked hatchet men. So if you can write a story that begins with those 3 words, you're guaranteed people are going to read on. They probably are, to find out, what did they do with the hatchets and why were they wearing the masks. So this drive to get the news right at the start of your reporting is really, really a kind of hardwired into journalism. Then we talk about the nut graph. This is kind of an American phrase for that paragraph that explains why this story is important at this particular time. Journalists are trained that'll come further down your report. Might be 3rd or 4th thing you refer to. This comes as that kind of paragraph. So the context is put down the story. Now I'm going to suggest that with climate change, the context is everything. The context is the story. The context of the climate breakdown, the context of the biodiversity emergency, that things that wouldn't be newsworthy, wouldn't be worth commenting on, are now because of those contexts. So I'm suggesting that journalism, climate journalism, environmental journalism needs to bring in the context more often and earlier than it does. I know it's a small thing, but I think it is important. To come back to Trish's other question that she would ask about nature, about where is nature, where is journalism? Because of these time pressures, journalism is now mostly in offices, in studios, in hubs, possibly even people working from home. The days of reporters going out somewhere, meeting somebody face to face, seeing something for themselves. Journalists do that kind of reporting now, but it's for books. It's for longer projects. News journalists working for media organisations are under bright lights all the time. They've lost their connection with their audience and they've lost the connection with nature. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had the Mary Raftery Memorial Lecture here given by a journalist who writes for the Irish Times now, Justine McCarthy, and she was talking about some of the work she'd done with the female victims of clerical abuse, and the time that she had to put into developing and the relationship with the sources, and the time she had to put into researching the stories. We used to have time for that, and we increasingly we don't. So I'm going to just conclude with some things that we might want to think about. Yes, of course, we do need breaking news type journalism that is just kind of about getting the information across. But I think we need to have other types of journalism, solutions journalism, slower journalism, more context-driven journalism. Because I think, and advocacy journalism, because we've heard from, I was really struck by some of the contributions earlier on, that information, and graphs and data. I mean, if data were going to move us to do anything about climate change, we would have solved it 25 years ago. It's moving people from the heart that needs to happen, and some form of journalism that does that is required as well. We constantly talk about needing, that business as usual can't continue in various sectors, energy, agriculture, and so on. I'm wondering, the way we train journalists, the way journalists think, the way journalists write and put together their reports, is journalism as usual going to cut it either? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave, for that, for leaving us with this very important question. I have a whole page of notes. I'm finding the contributions absolutely fascinating, and I have so many insights already in terms of those conflicts, of time-based conflicts to do with something that requires sustained attention, and then increasing pressures coming for journalists from the so-called attention economy, or this idea of social acceleration, that there's this feeling that everything is speeding up, and increasingly we don't have the time think more deliberately about these key issues. So I think the topic of the panel in terms of newsroom time versus geological time is really important. What I'm going to suggest that we do, though, is I would like to open this up to the audience first, and then we can maybe come back to these issues if time allows. But I'd like to allow some contributions from the audience. So I have two ladies here in the front that have caught my eye, and I'm going to do what Dermot did and see have we got. I'll keep an eye on the balcony as well for contributions.
Thank you. My name is Jacinth Barnes. Listening to all of you, it's very interesting, but I get the impression it's like the media are in crisis, or at best in a transition. So I guess the question I'm asking is, where have you the time to imagine? We're all talking about this imagining future. Where have you the time to imagine the future, to really try to get across the crisis in a way that you want those who read it to connect?
So would anybody like to take the lead on that? I guess that's for everybody on the panel, or nobody in particular. So would anybody like to start with that question about the crisis and those aspects of journalism? Shauna?
There aren't enough hours in the day, honestly. I'll be completely honest. The amount of reports, the amount of new reports, EPA reports, IPCC reports, UNFCCC reports, and it's tough to find the time to read all of them, to get them straight in your own head, because you've got to know what you're going to report on before you then try and present it in a way that's going to be easy for the public to sort of take in and figure out, why is this important to me? And I write for tabloids, and that's probably the most important part of the job. We do report the issues. We do report that time's running out. We do report that the planet's heating up and all the rest of it. And I think, we're doing a lot. But to speak to your point about the media and crisis, I think we have challenges. Yes, you're right. And those challenges are constant, but it's an ever-changing landscape, a bit like life, and a bit like, the way that we need to adapt to change with the climate as well. I'll pass it to John now. I hope that answers your question. Is that okay? Yeah.
We might go with Sinead and then John. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, no, just one other quick comment is, I think, and we mentioned climate education and climate literacy on it earlier with David, and I think what's really important is that all journalists are trained in some level of climate literacy and of climate journalism, because what we actually need is a situation where across journalism the issue of climate change is in the back of people's minds, whether you're reporting on the arts, whether you're reporting on sport, whether you're, whatever, because it actually has a role. So in my former life I was an arts correspondent, and if you go down to cover a festival, in the back of your head you could be asking what's happening to tents, what's happening to water, why is people doing that. So that's another way of telling the story, is just making sure that you don't sort of divide off, I suppose, environmental or climate reporting into one area, that it is in people's minds when they ask political questions, when they ask sports questions, when they ask all sorts of questions. And one way of doing that is by encouraging it as a discipline itself and having it in the back of people's minds when journalism itself is being taught.
John, maybe you next.
Yeah. I think it's often been shown in various surveys that the public gets their cue on what's important from how the media stacks it up. So that's where we get our ideas and the structuring of newspapers, like front pages and all the rest. That's how it works. And a lot of it does, in my view. I know we can talk about media and crisis, and it's true. However, there's also a crisis of focus. I mean, for example, nothing against golf, by the way, but if we can cover the US Masters, with actual reporters at the US Masters, but we can't cover climate conferences, we've got to ask ourselves a question: what the heck? Right? Seriously, nothing against golf, but we're in an emergency here. And you've got to, those decisions, I'm not blaming the golf correspondent, they go where they're sent. But I've got to ask that person's editor and that person's manager, what are you thinking? Seriously, what are you thinking? And I think, from my point of view, I'm fortunate that I don't have to work the daily beat, which gives me the ability to step back. But to go to your question, I've thrown tens followed by hundreds of thousands of words at that very conundrum. What magical combination of words, what ideas, what stories can I tell that will turn the key and people go, oh my God. And you know what? Every now and again, it actually works. Not very often, but it actually does. So I think we're all bashing away at the wall, trying to get a crack in that wall, trying to break through to people.
Thank you.
Dave, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, just to, I think your question gets at something, quite deep about it, that, people like Shauna are so caught up in it, and it's such a hamster wheel of daily production that who has the time to stand back and come up with the what my colleague Pat Burton would call a new imaginary of how it can be reimagined to work and to be more sustainable in itself, and also to resonate with audiences. Maybe the solution comes from outside the media in the end, that it can't, it's so busy running to stand still within the present system that maybe it can't kind of come up with a view from outside. I kind of think that, we need loads of different kind of media in loads of different audience segments. The mass media and the press and so on are a big part of it. But there's also, and it'll be startups, it'll be small kind of slow journalism initiatives, it'll be NGOs, it'll be stuff like that are doing different kinds of journalism for different audiences, and something might kind of come up out of that.
Okay, thank you. And yourself beside that other lady.
Yes, thank you very much. That was very interesting. My question was around, I know that journalists have to write what will be read, and they're many times answerable to the kind of clicks, as was mentioned, and there's the whole concept of if it bleeds, it leads, and all that sort of thing. Do you think that there's a due diligence that the media has to do when you pitch somebody who's sharing and using fact against somebody who's using opinion? And I think that there's a Punch and Judy kind of thing that wants to be done, like particularly, say, in television programs. And do you think that we have a responsibility, and maybe even to use the word, but you can cause harm when you put somebody who's sharing fact around the climate crisis, but I mean, you can talk about this in relation to migration or many other issues, and then somebody who's just sharing their personal opinion or the opinions of an organisation. And how do you combat that? By being balanced and not, like, obviously censoring, but not sharing, not putting those two people as if they're sharing something equally well-researched and robust. Thank you.
Another great question, thank you. Would anybody like to lead with that one? Yeah, Dave will go first for this.
Start off. There's a lot of research about this, looking at media coverage and balance. And when it started to become a media topic in the late 80s, there was a 50-50 balance, like journalists used to say, well, here's a climate scientist, let me find somebody who doesn't believe in climate science. That's, not the case anymore. But it did lead to what has been called a lost decade of so-called balanced coverage that was actually kind of an information bias. The idea of kind of the Punch and Judy show or the is very attractive to journalists because conflict and drama are two of the kind of big things that they look for. John knows quite a lot about that kind of arena, so I'll let him answer to that. But I think in non-broadcast journalism, where it's not the talk show and the opinion thing, that balance, we're now veering towards evidence-based reporting. So hopefully, and long may that continue.
Yeah, would anybody else like to contribute? John?
I'm happy, since Dave bounced that one roughly, that curveball over here. I mean, I know, for example, if I get a call at 7 or 8 o'clock about, doing early morning radio, quote, debate on, well, whatever the topic, that the other side of that debate is going to be a colourful, rural, independent TD. And I tip my hat to them, and some actually wear hats. They're very good. They're very media friendly. They're incredibly available, but it is insane the extent to which the media, the broadcasters, are going to the same tiny handful of people. And there are lots of independent TDs in the Dáil who I personally have never debated with, because clearly they're not being invited on. Why not? I guess they're not as much crack. They're just not prepared to really put the boot in. And therefore, they're not getting invited on radio. So that suggests, again, back to Dave's point, there's the drama element. And I totally get it. I remember being on a panel, at least one panel, I think it was a TV panel, and there was 4 of us, and we were all agreeing that climate change was a big problem and we needed solutions. And you could see the presenter just shrinking in their chair going, oh shit, this is getting worse and worse, because what maybe that was the fault of the panellists, the other panellists, of course. But the reality was, what was missing was the creative tension, the other sideism. And it was very difficult in the structure on that particular occasion to recreate, to fake the tension, if you like.
Shauna?
I can only really speak about my personal experience when I'm researching a story, when it's an investigation or any story that I write. If I see something that's questionable, I'll go and research it and I'll look it up and I'll make sure that take for example, this is not a politician in the south, this is a politician in the north. Recently a newspaper published that he said that hedgehogs are part of the problem with the decline of bees. And I, honest to God, was like, how did they put that in there with a straight face, without any balance or any expert to say, hold on a minute here, that is not right. You can't. I'm still trying to get an interview with a guy to ask him what he was thinking or where that came from or who told him that. But with environmental stories, and while I do sort of have to feed into the daily news list and all the rest of it, I'm really lucky in that I get a lot of time to look at investigations and to do those things. And I'll always have some of those ticking across in the background, whether that's in relation to peat extraction or wind turbines or things going on with like quilcher planting on peat bogs and not really doing as much as they probably could be doing to help with the climate crisis. But with those stories and with those reports, your research has to be 100%, There's a lot of trolls out there on social media and they're only too happy to jump on something that you do a report about and try and examine the facts of what you say if it goes against their personally held beliefs. So for newspaper reporters, like David pointed out earlier before, we've got to do our research and you've got to be able to stand over what people are saying and what you're giving them a platform to say.
Sinead, would you like to speak as well?
Yeah, just very quickly. First of all, I agree with what David said. I think it is a lot less, this sense that there had to be climate plus climate deniers doesn't really happen, certainly not to the extent it did before. If anything, balance is in different ways. It's different parts of the story. It's, different people talking about it. For example, a conference today, like this one today, if it was 20 years ago, I imagine you would have had to have what was called the other side. But thankfully, now the conference is put on with the absolute acceptance that this is the issue and this is what we discuss. But I think what I do want to go back to again is the issue of media literacy, because whatever happens on a programme or in a newspaper or on a radio station, if the audience themselves are informed about the facts and if they're aware of how to listen critically and how to listen accurately, I think that's hugely important. So having media literacy in the schools and all the way up and encouraging critical thinking and people to be informed and to be aware and to know that what they're seeing or hearing is opinion, I think does go away towards tackling it too.
Great, thank you. We have yourself here and I see yourself there. Yes, so hopefully we'll get to all three of you. Yeah, sorry, you go ahead there.
Thanks to all the speakers, and indeed the whole day has been very interesting, but I'm very interested in climate change, environmental issues, and to you as people in the media, one thing I would say is sometimes I feel jaded by it. Sometimes you just think, I can't read some more bad news. And I think that's something to think about. My background in psychiatry, I think a big issue is, and I know John was at a Psychology Society of Ireland meeting a while back talking about climate anxiety and denial. And I think a lot of people don't allow themselves to even be anxious. They switch off, they tune out because it's too big to even think about. And so I suppose one of the things I think about is that we do need to hear more about the solutions. That I recently started to study more about this area, and I was really stunned at how much really fantastic work there is, how many good ideas there are around, how much work scientists, engineers have done, and so many thinkers in so many different fields of work. There are so many ideas out there about what could work better. And when you talk about tension, we need to create tension around people who are saying we have to maintain the status quo. This is the only way we can do things. We have to do it this way, because, grow up, somebody has to make money, we need to fuel the economy. So,
sorry to cut across you there, but just maybe we could get on to...
Yeah. Sorry.
Is your question around solutions? No problem. Is your question around kind of solutions journalism?
Well, it's around, do we need to be pulling up more about,
right.
The kind of solution and the kind of work there is out there that can get us on the right path?
Right. I know, Dave, you mentioned solutions journalism and advocacy journalism, but Shauna, did you have a perspective as well you'd like to start with?
Really interesting question, and you're right, people are turning off from the news, and we know that is an issue, and sometimes you can't blame them because cost of living crisis, rising prices of everything else, everything just seems to be a stream of misery. But to answer your question, my editor decided a few years ago we should do a sort of test on different sorts of... We did a mix of reporting on the issues at hand, rising seas, all of those sorts of things, what's happening in relation to waste, what's happening with fast fashion. But we also do a lot of, solutions reporting. There was a really great scheme a while back where the traveller community had decided to put a lot of effort into like a mattress recycling scheme, and I know that got a lot of coverage, and there is a lot of that sort of reporting out there. But you're right, it maybe does seem like the more catastrophizing sort of stories take over. But what was really interesting from that test that we did with our Reach for Zero campaign was that when we put all of those stories online, it was the ones about the sea level rise is going to engulf Dublin or Cork or Galway. Those were the ones that got the most people reading the story. And I don't know where we really go from there, because we do try to give it a rounded sort of a view, and sort of even use it as a platform to highlight information on how people can be better in themselves, or what business needs to do, or what the architecture sort of arena is doing in terms of how they reduce carbon from the design stage in buildings and all the rest of it. Those stories are out there and they are being reported, but maybe it just seems like the more sort of depressing ones, for want of a better word, maybe get the headlines a little bit more. So I can get what you're saying. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Shauna. Yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, I always like to bring my cup of cheer to these sessions. I think it is important to say that problems have solutions and predicaments have outcomes. Climate change is not a problem; it's a predicament. What we have ahead of us are a range of possible outcomes. None of them are great. Some of them are really bad, but none of them are great. That's been honest. And again, to put numbers on that, 30 years ago when the Intergovernmental Panel process kind of kicked off in earnest and tackling climate, since that time, we've emitted as much carbon pollution as in all of human history, up until the time when we started tackling climate change, right? So it's incredibly important, while looking for positive and keeping our chin up, that we don't engage in self-delusion, that mistaking small actions while the ship goes down. And I know that wasn't your intent, but I think it's incredibly important. We have to keep tacking back to reality, right? And to frame all our good news stories within the context of how are we doing against reality. And as I say, at the moment, not so great.
Thanks, John.
Oh no, I'm all for them, but we need to be super careful that we tack them against the news story, like renewable energy, right? Brilliant. Is renewable energy replacing fossil energy? No, it's augmenting fossil energy. So you can focus on renewable energy and miss the point. That's really what I'm getting at.
Okay, thank you. What we might do is, if you don't, or do you have an answer, Dave? Because we're running quite short of time, and I don't want to subject us to an actual high intensity interval training session as punishment.
I do have a couple of thoughts on the question. Sorry, where are you there? There is a grow. I see some colleagues that I work with here on the Reuters digital news report, which tracks news habits, there's growing news avoidance. That's definitely one of the trends we're seeing. And it's not just to do with climate change, it's just to do with the slew of crises that we're facing at the moment. My little contribution earlier was about rethinking journalism as usual. And journalism as usual is very drawn to negative things. So bad news is much more prominent in journalism than good news. And it's drawn to conflict and some of the other things we spoke about. I've recently been reading a bit about solutions journalism, which isn't kind of Pollyanna-ish, let's just pretend it's all going to be fine. It is reporting problems or predicaments that focus on the solution. So instead of saying, as Shauna mentioned earlier, Dublin is going to be under 10 feet of water, you don't lead off with that. You lead off with people or some proposed solution, so that the solution comes first rather than the problem. Okay, and that is kind of an interesting reframing of how journalism can be done, and it could be part of a larger kind of rethink of the journalism as usual paradigm that we're in at the moment.
Thank you very much. We're getting quite short on time, so I think did yourself there have you've the mic. So maybe a short question if that's okay. Thank you.
It's very short. This has been brilliant. Thank you. My question is, I guess I don't even know who I'm going to be asking, but all is, can we continue with our national broadcaster and our print media, yada yada yada, trying to raise money by putting, flights and cars cheek by jowl with, rising sea levels and the disasters all around the world? And I get that it's really hard to make a book, but for God's sake, something has to change. I think it's immoral at this stage. It's just pure wrong.
To abuse my chair's position, I did an EPA report on that a while ago for the 5th IPCC report. I can talk to you about it again, but I'd like to hand over to my colleagues, and that's a real political economy question. Where does broadcasting get its funding? And even bigger questions of what should be funded in the global north, and what are priorities around where money is distributed. So there's a lot in there, a big question. So would anybody like to begin to finish up? So maybe some brief comments.
At the hazard of getting myself the sack, I raised this very same question internally not so long ago. And I did put this to our advertising and marketing team. And obviously it is something that happens, but newspapers, for the vast majority of newspapers and newspaper groups, are businesses, when they need to find the money somewhere to fund the journalism. And the answer that I was given internally was that if the advertising standards don't have any issue with an advert, then, But it's one of those, I think it's a bigger sort of issue, and it's not just like an individual question for each paper, but I see it raised all the time. You've got a story about climate and then take cheap flights to Amsterdam or Australia or whatever. I hear your point completely, and I feel it.
Well, I think this is probably more acute, I suspect, for the broadcast media, and I personally would strongly favour that we move to a fund that funds journalism and move away. RTE, for example, has had a hybrid funding model, which I believe has delivered the worst of both possible worlds for them. That on the one hand, you've got a certain public subvention on the one hand, and on the other hand, capture by commercial interests, which is against what we want from a national broadcaster. I would much prefer to see RTE, Virgin and the radio stations funded from a central fund. And you might say, well, where's the magic money tree? We have social media corporations raking up billions in advertising. They need to be levied to fund proper journalism, because mostly they're just soaking back the output of real journalists and reselling it and packaging it. So the money is there, And I think if we can have a situation where journalism gets on with its job, and it's too important a job to be left purely to the market, in my view. I think positive interventions, and of course the state can't be doing it. You need a buffer so that there's no implication of political control being attached to funding of media. We don't want to go that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Sinead, would you like to have the last word on this? And unfortunately, I have a big time's up sign here, so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get into your other questions, but maybe, Sinead, you might finish up from the perspective from the Coimisiún.
I won't give a definitive perspective from the Commission, simply because that issue of public funding of the media is obviously very live and is in discussion, and there are many reports being waited on and so on. So hopefully there will be. I actually first reported on the idea of a broadcast fund rather than a licence fee, I think, in about 2012. So when I was media correspondent for RTE, it was being talked about back when we all had Nokia phones and were talking about one day your news will be on this phone, and people couldn't believe it. So it's an issue that's been around for a long time, but I do believe we are certainly closer than we were to getting a solution to it. So hopefully, that will emerge. But I think just to go back to the other issue about the big stories and the small stories, I think we need both. I think we need media that are telling the massive crisis that we heard about today, but are also telling the small stories that will hook in the new listeners. Because the other thing we didn't get to talk about a huge amount today is the new listeners and the non-broadcast media watchers and the non-newspaper readers. Because I have two of them at home, and they don't watch a bulletin at 6 and they don't watch a bulletin at 9. They're consuming it all from the phone. And I think one way of hooking them in is by the smaller, more positive stories. Yes, it's not maybe getting across the huge crisis, but it's making them aware and making them think, and they're the next generation we've been talking about. We need to speak directly to them as well. Sorry, I know that's slightly off the point. It's just not something that was raised throughout the hours. So,
thank you. And I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I'd like you to put your hands together for our guest in the media panel. Thank you very much.